My name is Elena. I'm 32. And 3 weeks ago, I came home to find I didn't have one anymore. I stood on the front porch of our old house in Boulder Creek, backpack over one shoulder, suitcase at my feet, fingers curling around a brass key I'd used since I was 10. But when I turned it in the lock, nothing happened. They'd changed it. Behind me, the old wooden swing, Dad's last gift before he passed, creaked softly in the wind, empty and swaying like it remembered me better than the people inside. Then my phone buzzed. It was from my sister, Veronica. "You're no longer part of this family. Don't come back." Just one sentence, but it split something open inside me. Not loud, but clean. Final. I knocked. No one answered. I called her name. Nothing. Only the soft breeze and that swing. We'd fought before, but this, changing the locks, sending a text, pretending I never existed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, with my key in one hand and a message in the other. One useless, one unforgettable. They thought I'd just walk away. But what they didn't know was that I had keys to another door. And that door, they couldn't change. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment. Subscribe. You won't believe what's next, because this story is only just beginning. I don't remember how long I stood there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. The sun had begun to dip just below the roofline, casting the porch in long, familiar shadows. I pressed my palm to the door one last time. It was warm, like it still held traces of our childhood sticky fingers after popsicles, hands pressed to cool wood during hide-and-seek, palms bracing against the surface as we fought to get the words out during our first real argument. But now it was a wall, not an invitation. I stepped back, down the porch steps, onto the path lined with cracked red bricks my father laid himself when I was 12. And then I did something I didn't plan to do. I circled around the side of the house, quietly, almost automatically. The side window by the kitchen had always been a little loose. Veronica and I used to sneak out that way when we weren't supposed to go to the creek at dusk. Back then, we used to cover for each other. Back then, she still looked at me like I belonged. I crouched under the window now, not to break in, but just to see. To prove to myself it wasn't some surreal misunderstanding, but the light was on, and inside, she was there, sitting calmly at the dining table, a glass of red wine in hand, laughing. Her laptop was open in front of her. A man, her new boyfriend, maybe was setting a bowl of pasta down in front of her like they'd just finished watching a movie and were settling in for a cozy night. She hadn't looked back, hadn't stood by the door to see if I was still there. She had shut me out, and then poured a glass of wine. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about anger, or some fight we forgot to finish. This was a decision. She had planned this. I walked back to my car in silence. Didn't cry, not yet, but in my chest, something curled up tight. I sat behind the wheel for a while, engine off, hands limp in my lap. The street was quiet. The air smelled like pine needles and old earth. That smell used to make me feel safe. Now, it just made me feel like a guest in my own past. I stared up at the house. From this angle, you could just see the attic window, my old room, where I used to string Christmas lights year-round. I stayed up all night to finish college applications. I hid after Mom's funeral because I couldn't stand how loud the silence was downstairs. That room held versions of me no one else had seen, and now, someone else might be sleeping there. I drove away that night with nowhere to go but a motel just outside of town. The room smelled like bleach and desperation, thin walls, stiff pillows, and a TV that played the same 3 commercials over and over. But at least it had a lock I controlled. I sat cross-legged on the bed, scrolling through old text threads with Veronica. They were mostly short, passive, practical. Picking you up at 4 tomorrow. Dad's lawyer said we need to get the paperwork in order. I took care of the property tax bill. You can just Venmo me half. Nothing loving, nothing cruel, just neutral. But buried in that neutrality was the real story. We hadn't been sisters in years. We'd just been co-managers of a fading legacy. When our parents passed, first Dad, then Mom. Just a year later, we were too busy handling things to actually grieve. There were bank accounts to close, a will to read, furniture to sort, dusty corners to clean. And then there was the house. It was too much to sell right away. Too many memories. Too many boxes are still taped shut. So we agreed Veronica would stay. I'd move for work. We'd deal with it eventually. Eventually never came. What came instead was silence. Missed calls, emails that went unanswered, birthdays forgotten, holidays skipped, until suddenly, the locks were changed. And I was no longer a co-owner of grief. I was just a threat to be erased. But here's the part that kept gnawing at me in that motel bed. Why now? Why this week? Why the sudden finality? There had to be more than just sibling tension. There was something else beneath this. Something sharper. Because shutting someone out is one thing, but cutting legal ties, changing locks, getting a lawyer involved, that's strategy. That's war. And I was starting to realize I wasn't just locked out. I was being written out. The next morning, I woke up to an email. Subject line: property ownership clarification. Urgent action required. From a law firm I didn't recognize. The message was cold, direct. Veronica had engaged legal counsel. They were requesting that I sign a voluntary relinquishment of interest in the Boulder Creek property immediately. Attached a document, 3 pages long, filled with legal jargon, lines for my signature. No warmth, no explanation, no mention of our parents. Only a deadline, 3 days. That's when I knew. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a land grab, and the land in question was my childhood. But if she thought I'd sign that paper quietly, she'd forgotten one thing. I may have left town, but I never left my name, and I wasn't about to give it up. I didn't open the document right away. Instead, I sat in the motel room with the lamp still on, the cheap curtains barely blocking out the morning sun, and just stared at the subject line. Property ownership clarification. Urgent action required. The words didn't sting, they echoed through every hallway I used to walk, echoed through my mother's voice reading bedtime stories in that house, echoed in the sound of Dad's boots by the back door, echoed in the silence of holidays after they were gone. Veronica was trying to make legal what she had already made personal. She wasn't just locking me out of the house, she was locking me out of the story. I finally opened the document. 3 pages. Cold. Measured, professional. The tone was sterile, but I knew her fingerprints were all over it. Veronica had always preferred clarity over emotion. When we were teenagers, I cried when we had to put our childhood dog down. She didn't. When Mom passed, I curled into the hallway outside the hospital room, knees to chest. Veronica started coordinating funeral logistics before the nurses had even stripped the bed. That was how she grieved efficiently. But this wasn't grief. This was erasure. I scrolled through the legal jargon: assignments of interest, voluntary relinquishment, claims to real property. At the bottom was a signature line, mine, and below that, a deadline 72 hours from receipt. I almost laughed, as if a deadline could undo decades, as if ink on a line could make me disappear. As if I would ever let that happen again. I leaned back in the stiff motel chair and looked at the faded painting above the bed, a print of some nameless forest, serene, artificial. It reminded me of the painting in our childhood hallway, the one Veronica hated. Too dark, she used to say. Too many trees. You can't see what's coming. Maybe that's what this had always been about. Control, visibility. She needed to see everything coming, needed to steer every outcome. And me, I was the one thing she couldn't predict. Because I left. Because I built something without her. Because I didn't stay in the house after our parents died, clutching memories like metals. I loved our parents. I honored them. But I didn't live inside their ghost. And maybe that made me dangerous. I closed the laptop and stared at my reflection in the black screen. I looked tired, not just from the travel, or the cheap room, or the betrayal, but from carrying the weight of not being believed. That was always the undercurrent between us. She was the responsible one, the one who stayed, the one who paid the bills, kept the house, and did the right thing. And me, I was the dreamer, the one who moved to Portland, took the consulting job, the one who sent money instead of memories, the one who was too busy to come home. At least, that's the story she told. But it wasn't true. Not the way she told it. Because I came home when it mattered. I came home to take care of Mom during her last month. I was the one who held her hand through hospice, who fed her ice chips when she couldn't swallow, who read her favorite poetry until her breathing slowed and stopped. Veronica. She handled the paperwork, the prescriptions. She avoided the room when the crying got too loud. But when the will was read, and the lawyer spoke those 6 words, shared ownership of the family home, Veronica's jaw clenched just slightly. I noticed, but I said nothing. Maybe I should have. Now, sitting in that motel room, I realized something. Veronica had never forgiven me for being the one who left. And she certainly never forgave me for coming back and still being part of the picture. This legal move wasn't just about the house. It was about shrinking the narrative, making it hers, only hers. If I sign, I thought, she wins. But this wasn't a game, and I wasn't here to play. I was here because I refused to vanish quietly. I took out a pen and a legal pad from my bag, not to respond. Not yet, but to remember. I wrote down everything. Dates, memories, events. The moment I got the key to that house at 16. The photo of me and Veronica on the front porch with Mom after her last chemo session, me holding her hand. Veronica, looking away. The mortgage payment I'd contributed to when I got my first bonus. The email where Dad wrote, "I'm so proud of you, baby. And I'm glad you and your sister will always have each other." I kept writing until the page was full. Until it felt like I was taking up space again. My space. My right. That night, I didn't sleep much. But I slept enough. Enough to know what I had to do next. I called my own lawyer the next morning. "Hi," I said. "I need help. My sister's trying to erase me from our parents' will, and I don't plan on letting that happen." She asked for the documents. I forwarded them. She asked for history. I gave her everything. And when I hung up, for the first time in days, I didn't feel helpless. I felt ready, because Veronica may have had a lawyer, but I had the truth, and I was done being silent. The lawyer's name was Catherine Reed. Sharp mind, softer voice than I expected. She didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't offer empty sympathy. She just listened. And when I finished telling her what Veronica had done, changing the locks, the text, the email, the voluntary relinquishment, Catherine leaned back slightly and said, "Then we don't respond to her document. We respond with our own." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You're saying, I have a case." She nodded. "You have more than that. You have rights. And it sounds like your sister's banking on you being too exhausted or too hurt to use them." She was right. Veronica wasn't expecting a legal battle. She was expecting silence. That night, I sat at a small desk in the motel room, sifting through old emails, family files, bank statements, anything that could prove my continued involvement in the house. I found receipts, copies of a roof repair we'd split 6 years ago, an invoice for landscaping work under both our names, a forwarded email from Dad with a PDF copy of the original will. He'd written, "Shared ownership, equal say, you girls figure it out." I smiled reading that. Dad was many things. Subtle wasn't one of them, but fair always. And even from the grave, he had tried to protect that fairness. Catherine filed an initial notice to contest Veronica's claim to sole ownership. We submitted proof that the house was still legally in both our names and that no updated will had ever been formally filed or certified. It was the first domino, and once it fell, others began to wobble. The first call came from Mrs. Langford, our next-door neighbor for 20 years. She'd seen me outside that day, standing on the porch. She hadn't said anything then, but now, she wanted to speak. "I didn't realize what was happening," she said, voice trembling. "But when I saw your sister pouring wine that night like nothing had happened, I knew something wasn't right." She offered to write a statement. It wasn't much, legally, but emotionally, it was everything. Someone had seen, someone remembered, someone didn't look away. Then came Derek, our father's accountant. He still had copies of the estate documents on file, still remembered the instructions. David was clear. He told Catherine, the house went to both daughters, jointly. No exceptions. I'd stake my license on it. We didn't ask him to, but he sent over a notarized letter within 24 hours. And then, unexpectedly, there was Maria, Mom's best friend from the book club. I hadn't spoken to her since the funeral. She and Veronica had a falling out shortly after. Something about control over the memorial fund. She showed up at Catherine's office unannounced, sat in the waiting room with a tote bag full of memories, photos, letters, one birthday card from Mom to me, dated just a year before she passed. It read, "I know things have been difficult between you and Veronica, but this house will always be yours too, no matter what she says." In the corner, Mom had scribbled, "P.S. You still owe me a blueberry pie next visit." I cried reading that one, not just because of what it meant, but because Mom knew. Even then, she knew. Piece by piece, the version of reality Veronica had built started to collapse. She had painted me as distant, as absent, as uninterested in the home, in the legacy, in the family. But now, the document spoke. The neighbor spoke. Even Mom, in her own handwriting, spoke. And the picture that emerged wasn't the one Veronica had hoped for. It was messy, honest, real. It didn't fit on a legal form, but it fit the truth. Catherine told me we were ready to file for a full hearing. The court would review the evidence, examine the validity of any updated documents Veronica might try to introduce, and, if necessary, intervene on the matter of property ownership. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt instead was exhausted, because no matter how strong our case was, I knew what was coming, not just from her lawyers, but from her. Veronica didn't lose gracefully. She didn't let go easily, and when backed into a corner, she always reached for the one weapon that worked best: guilt. That night, I received a text. From her. No subject, just a message. "You really think dragging this through court is what Mom would have wanted?" I stared at the screen for a long time, and for a brief moment, I felt it, that old tug in my chest, the one that whispered, "You're overreacting. You're ruining everything. Just let it go." But then I remembered the locked door. I remembered the swing on the porch. I remembered the birthday card in Maria's tote bag. "This house will always be yours too." I didn't reply. Instead, I turned off the phone, and for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly, not because it was over, but because I had finally stopped apologizing for standing where I belonged. The phone rang just past 10 p.m. At first, I didn't recognize the number. It wasn't saved, no name, no label, just 10 digits staring back at me through the soft glow of the motel lamp. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut said answer it. I pressed accept. Silence on the other end. Then her voice. Soft. Unfamiliar. Somehow. But undeniably hers. "Elena, it's me. Veronica." For a second, I said nothing, just listened, to the faint crackle of air between us, to the sound of my own breath catching in my throat, to the ghost of the sister I used to know, drifting through the speaker like she hadn't changed the locks, like she hadn't tried to erase me with a PDF. I figured you wouldn't want to talk, she said quickly, before I could speak. I wanted to explain. There it was. That word. Explain. Not apologize. Not confess. Do not take responsibility. Just explain. I know how it looks, she continued, her voice steadying, but things haven't been easy. I've been here alone, handling everything. The house, the repairs, the taxes. It's a lot. You left. And I stayed. I exhaled slowly. There it was again. The narrative. The carefully built, guilt-framed martyr story I'd heard a dozen different ways over the years. But this time, I wasn't sitting on the back porch nodding in silence. This time, I wasn't swallowing discomfort just to keep the peace. This time, I had something stronger than pain. I had clarity. You didn't call to explain, I said quietly. You called because you're scared. There was a pause. She didn't deny it. Instead, she pivoted. Dragging our family into court, do you really think that's what Mom and Dad would have wanted? I stood up from the bed, walked slowly to the window, looked out at the empty parking lot and the flickering sign above the motel roof. I could have answered with anger. I could have listed every receipt, every memory, every moment she'd tried to overwrite. But I didn't. Instead, I asked her a question. Do you remember Mom's last week? She was quiet. I remember, I said. You left the room every time she cried. You told the hospice nurse to close the door because the sound was too much. I held her hand. Veronica, I heard her last breath. And still after all that, she left the house to both of us. Not just you. Veronica didn't respond. Just a soft inhale, like maybe she hadn't expected I would speak from that place. That grief, that memory, that wound that still hadn't fully closed. I'm not taking you to court, I said calmly. You took me there when you locked the door behind me and handed a lawyer my name. I'm not fighting to win. I'm fighting to exist. In the place where I was born. In the house where I buried our mother. In the story of our family. And I won't let you edit me out of it. This time, she didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice cracked just slightly. You don't understand. Elena, I needed control. Everything was falling apart. And the house. It was all I had. There it was. The truth. Not in the legal arguments, not in the deadlines, but in fear. Veronica had lost her anchors, our parents, her routines, her control, and the house had become her lifeboat. But instead of sharing it, she tried to cling to it by pushing me overboard. I almost pitied her. Almost, but not enough to back down. You still have the house, I said. You still live there, but you don't get to pretend I never existed in it. Another pause. Then, so what happens now, she asked, voice small. I closed my eyes for a moment, thought about the court date approaching, the witness statements, the documents, the truth, finally laid bare. And then I said, now, you sit with the choices you made, and I show up in court, not to destroy you, but to reclaim what you tried to take from me. Not the house, the truth. She didn't say goodbye, just hung up. No last plea, no apology, just silence. And this time, it didn't sting, because I knew what silence meant now. It wasn't an absence. It was a consequence. I slid my phone onto the nightstand and turned off the lamp. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and pavement. A motel room wasn't home, but it was shelter. And tomorrow, I'd stand before a judge, not because I needed revenge, but because I finally understood. Sometimes, reclaiming your place in the story isn't about being right. It's about refusing to be erased. The courthouse smelled like wood polish and quiet anxiety. I had arrived early, too early, probably, but I needed time. Time to breathe. Time to sit with the gravity of what was about to happen. The courtroom itself wasn't grand. No marble columns, no cinematic echoes. Just dull beige walls, a row of pew-like benches, and a judge's bench raised exactly 2 steps higher than everything else, just enough to remind you where power sat. But today, I didn't feel small. I wasn't there to plead. I was there to be counted. Catherine met me outside the hearing room, papers in hand, expression calm but alert. She wore a navy blue suit and flat shoes. No fuss. All focus. "Veronica's lawyer is here," she said quietly. I nodded. I didn't ask if Veronica had come too. I already knew she had, because people like Veronica don't miss the moment they think they might lose, even if they pretend they don't care. We took our seats. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s, eyes sharp but kind. Her robe hung loosely, but her posture didn't. "We're here today to review a dispute regarding property rights, specifically the status of joint ownership of the Morris family home." Her voice was steady, measured, but every word felt like a weight dropping into a still lake. Veronica sat across from me, hair tied back, face unreadable. She didn't look at me, not once. That, more than anything, told me everything. She wasn't here to see me. She was here to survive me. Catherine stood first, presented the documents like setting stones in a quiet path. The original will, the shared mortgage payments, my name on insurance records, my contributions to repairs, letters, emails, one birthday card. Each piece was small on its own, but together they were irrefutable, a pattern, a presence, a truth, that I had always been part of that house, even if someone else had stopped saying my name inside it. Then came the witnesses. Mrs. Langford spoke first, our old neighbor. She was nervous, fingers trembling slightly as she held her notes. I remember seeing Elena, standing on the porch. She looked confused, heartbroken. She knocked, but no one answered. She paused, and later that night, I saw her sister inside, laughing, drinking wine. The judge asked if she could confirm it was the same day the locks were changed. Yes, Your Honor. I remember because it was the day the school bus rerouted. My grandson mentioned it at dinner. Small detail, big impact, because it grounded the memory in time. And time is what truth clings to. Derek, our father's accountant, came next. Professional, clear. David Morris instructed me to keep both daughters on every title, document, and file. He was adamant. Equal ownership. No exceptions. Any alternate documentation submitted after his passing would have to be notarized and witnessed to be valid. Then he turned, briefly, toward Veronica. And none of that has been presented. His voice wasn't harsh, but it didn't need to be. Facts, when delivered plainly, carry their own kind of sharpness. And then, Maria, Mom's friend, her book club partner, her confidant, she walked in slowly, her floral scarf trailing behind her like a thread from another life. She took the stand and pulled out the card. The one Mom had written me. I know things have been difficult between you and Veronica, but this house will always be yours too, no matter what she says. Maria read it aloud. The room went silent. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. Then Maria added something that wasn't written. Your Honor, I was there. I was in the kitchen the day they signed the will. David and Anne both said out loud that this house belonged to both daughters equally. Not because of legal advice, but because of love. That last word hung in the air. Not dramatic, not sentimental, just honest and undeniable. Veronica's attorney tried to counter, presented the unsigned updated will. No witnesses, no notary, just Veronica's handwriting and a date scribbled in the corner. Catherine didn't even object. She didn't need to. The judge barely looked at it, because something had shifted. The room no longer saw Veronica's narrative. It saw her need, her fear, her desperation to keep control by cutting me out, and that desperation wasn't enough to undo a lifetime of proof. The judge called for a recess. Catherine and I stepped into the hallway. I leaned against the cold marble column, my heart pounding in my ears. Not from fear, from release. "You did great," Catherine said softly. I nodded. "Do you think she'll say anything?" She didn't need to ask who she was. Catherine glanced toward the other side of the hall. Veronica stood there, arms crossed, staring out a narrow window. She hadn't spoken all day, hadn't looked at me, not even now. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge gave her final words. Clear, measured, final. The court finds no evidence supporting a transfer of sole ownership. All documents point to joint possession, with equal legal standing. Any attempts to alter that ownership were informal and invalid. The house remains the legal property of both Elena and Veronica Morris. That was it. No fireworks, no gasps, just truth, spoken aloud and entered into the record. When we exited the building, the sky had begun to cloud over. The kind of sky that doesn't threaten storm, just asks for reflection. Veronica didn't follow me. She left through the side door, maybe to avoid the press, maybe to avoid me. Either way, it didn't matter. I wasn't looking for confrontation. I had already won what I came for. Not the house, the acknowledgement, the right to exist in the same sentence as my family. And no one, not even my sister, could take that away now. I didn't go back to the house after the verdict. Not because I couldn't, but because I no longer needed to. There was no ribbon to cut, no key to reclaim, no moment where I would stand on the porch and say, "See, I made it back." That version of the story where I triumphantly walk through the door I'd been locked out of, arms raised in quiet defiance. It didn't fit anymore, because this wasn't a return. This was a release. Veronica never reached out again. No call, no text, no apology. And strangely, that made it easier. Because sometimes, closure doesn't come in the form of reconciliation. Sometimes, it's the quiet understanding that the conversation is over, and that you're the one who gets to leave the room. A week after the court decision, I stood in front of a small 2-bedroom cottage in Santa Fe. It had adobe walls the color of sand, a turquoise front door, and a wooden swing that creaked ever so slightly when the wind blew. There were no ghosts here, just possibilities. The realtor handed me the keys and said something cheerful about mountain views and resale value. I nodded, smiled politely. But inside, something in me exhaled. A long-held breath. A grief I hadn't realized was still pressing against my ribs. This wasn't the house I was raised in, but it was the house I would choose to build a life in. Not because of legacy, but because of intention. The first night, I sat on the floor of the empty living room with a glass of water and a folding chair. No furniture yet, no noise. Just moonlight spilling through the front window and the quiet hum of distant wind chimes. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. I felt still. And in that stillness, I realized something. Veronica had tried to erase me from our parents' story, but I didn't need to fight her for a spot in the past. Because I was writing my future in ink, she couldn't smudge. I didn't hang family photos in this house. Not out of bitterness, but because I wanted the walls to breathe first. I wanted them to belong to no one before they belonged to me. I planted lavender in the front yard, hanged a wind chime above the kitchen sink, bought a second-hand reading chair with frayed arms and the softest seat I'd ever melted into. Little by little, it became mine. Not through possession, through presence. A few weeks later, I received a letter, handwritten, from Maria, the woman who had testified at the hearing, Mom's old friend, the keeper of so many gentle truths. Inside was a small card, no envelope, just a simple message. I'm proud of you, not for winning, for not shrinking. She'd included a photo, one I'd never seen before. It was of me and Mom, taken from behind. We were walking up the driveway of the old house, her arm looped through mine, my head tilted toward her. It was autumn, leaves crunching beneath our feet, shadows stretching ahead of us like reminders that time keeps moving, whether we ask it to or not. On the back of the photo, Maria had written, "This was the day your mom said, 'She'll be fine. She always finds her own way home.'" I held that picture in my hands for a long time. Not because I missed the house, but I missed what it meant. Before it became a battlefield. Before it was reduced to documents and deeds. Back when home was just another word for belonging. I pinned the photo on my fridge. Not framed. Not staged. Just present. A reminder that I came from something real, and that I carried it with me, no matter where I stood. People often think that justice is about reclaiming what was taken. Sometimes it is, but sometimes justice is quieter. It's choosing not to live inside someone else's story. It's walking away, not because you lost, but because you no longer need to stay to prove you deserve to be there. It's closing the door gently behind you, and then building a new one with your name carved into it. A month after settling in, I hosted my first dinner in the cottage. Just 4 people. Maria, Catherine, my neighbor, Luis, and Ava, a friend from Portland who happened to be passing through. We had roasted vegetables, crusty bread, and cheap wine. The conversation was light, easy, and for the first time in what felt like years, I laughed without a knot in my stomach. No one asked about Veronica. No one asked about court dates or old family homes. They just saw me, Elena, a woman with a turquoise door, wind chimes, and a secondhand reading chair, and that was enough. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the last goodbye was said, I stepped outside. The wind had picked up. I sat on the swing, let it move slowly beneath me, and I whispered something I hadn't said in a very long time. I'm home. Not back, just home. And that was everything. I didn't ask for updates. After the court hearing, I didn't check social media, didn't ask around town, didn't call the few people who still floated in Veronica's orbit. I told myself it was closure, that I'd already let go. But closure, I've learned, is a tricky thing. It doesn't always knock on the front door. Sometimes, it comes through the side window, in the form of someone else's silence. It was Luis, my new neighbor in Santa Fe, who told me. Not directly. He was chatting with a woman at the Saturday market, talking about siblings, real estate, and small towns. And somehow through the web of connection that always seems too convenient to be real, she mentioned Boulder Creek. And then, softly, the name Morris. He brought it up casually over dinner. She said the big house on Chestnut Drive looks empty these days. He said, reaching for the salt. Apparently, the woman who lives there keeps the curtains drawn, doesn't have visitors. Some old neighbor said the display cabinet by the stairs is bare now. I stopped mid-sip. The display cabinet. I knew exactly which one he meant. Mahogany wood, glass-fronted, 3 shelves, lit from the top with a soft yellow bulb. Dad installed himself. Growing up, it had been the shrine of our family pride. Trophies, photos, medals from track meets, Mom's antique porcelain rose, a small framed copy of Dad's Navy commendation, and later, pictures of us. And Veronica, first day of school, prom night, college graduations, all arranged carefully, almost reverently. Proof of life, proof of legacy, proof that we were a family worth displaying. When Mom died, the cabinet changed. Half the photos came down, the rose was moved, Dad's medal stayed, but shifted to the side, as if even it wasn't sure what belonged anymore. After the hearing, I hadn't thought about it, hadn't imagined what Veronica might do, but now I could picture it so clearly. Her standing in front of that cabinet, glass cleaner in one hand, a rag in the other, One by one, lifting each object, studying it, measuring how much of herself still existed in each frame, and then, gently but deliberately removing them. Not in anger, not in the ceremony, but in retreat. A week later, I received an email from Rachel, an old friend from high school. We hadn't spoken in years. She had bumped into Veronica at the grocery store in town, tried to be friendly, light. She looked tired. Rachel wrote, I asked how she was holding up. She said, "It's just quiet now." And then she smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She didn't mention you, didn't mention the case, but I thought you'd want to know. I did. Not because I wanted her to hurt, but because I needed to know that the silence I chose wasn't the only one ringing. Later that night, I sat by the fireplace in my Santa Fe home. The logs crackled gently. The room smelled like cedar and cinnamon, and I thought about the power of display. How we curate our lives not just for others, but for ourselves. How do we choose what to frame, what to light, what to keep in plain view, and what to bury in drawers? The cabinet at Chestnut Drive had once held our entire story, or at least the version of it we agreed to tell. But stories aren't static, and when you try to freeze a family in glass, eventually, something breaks. I don't know what Veronica sees when she walks past that empty case now. Maybe just dust, maybe regret, maybe nothing at all. But I know what I see. I see the space where truth once sat. It was edited, polished, and propped up for guests. And now that truth has moved. It's no longer locked in a house. It's in the air I breathe. I open the door without fear. The photo of me and Mom on my fridge, untouched by argument or inheritance. The day after Rachel's email, I went to the local thrift store. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but tucked between two old dressers, I saw it. A small glass cabinet, 3 shelves, slightly chipped on one corner, but the light still worked. I bought it on impulse, brought it home, cleaned it, and placed it by the window, where the light hits just right at dusk. It's not filled yet. Only one item sits inside. That photo of me and Mom, walking up the driveway. No trophies, no medals, no need for explanation. Just a moment. Unfiltered, undisputed, unafraid. Sometimes, what you remove from display says just as much as what you keep. And sometimes, the emptiest shelves hold the loudest truths. Because the absence of something can no longer be ignored. And once silence echoes loud enough, even glass can't hide it. The porch swing creaked softly beneath me. It had become a ritual now these quiet evenings in Santa Fe. Just me, a cup of tea, the sun folding itself gently into the desert horizon, and the rhythmic lull of the swing beneath my legs. There were no big conversations, no sudden epiphanies, just stillness. And sometimes, that was the loudest kind of healing. That night, the wind carried a faint scent of rain. Unusual for this time of year, but comforting. I pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders and looked out across the garden. The lavender I'd planted was blooming early, a soft line of purple against the pale ground. Resilient, steady, quietly beautiful. I hadn't spoken to anyone about Veronica in weeks. People had stopped asking, maybe out of politeness, maybe because they understood. Some things don't need retelling. They just need room. But that evening, as I sat on the swing, I found myself thinking not of the fight, not of the verdict, not even of the house. I thought of the summer we built this exact kind of swing with Dad. Back then, we were kids with mismatched socks and scraped knees. He let us help stain the wood, even though we left blotches everywhere. I remember Veronica arguing over who got to sit on it first. I let her win, not because I was weak, because back then, keeping peace felt more important than proving a point. Funny how habits like that try to follow you into adulthood until you outgrow them. I didn't expect to hear from her again, But silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, I saw someone I didn't recognize at first. Not because she'd changed, but because I wasn't waiting for reconciliation anymore. I wasn't clinging to a version of sisterhood that no longer fit. I wasn't holding out hope that she'd explain, or regret, or return to the version of herself I'd built my forgiveness around. Instead, I was learning how to exist without her in the room, and not feel like something was missing. That's not bitterness. It's boundary. There's a difference. Bitterness closes doors. Boundaries open different ones. Ones where I don't have to shrink. Ones where I don't have to explain why I'm still hurting. Ones where love doesn't require silence as currency. My phone buzzed once, pulling me out of thought. A message from Rachel, again. Hey, thought you'd want to know. Veronica listed the house. It's on the market. I read the sentence twice. The house, our house, the one she fought to keep, fought to claim, fought to erase me from, and now she was letting it go. There was no anger in me, no celebration, just a strange sense of inevitability, as if the house itself had grown tired of holding all that tension between its walls. Some structures crumble from disrepair, others from the silence between people. I stayed on the swing longer than usual that night, watched the last light sink behind the hills, and thought about what it meant to let something go. Really, let it go. Not because justice had been served, not because anyone apologized, but because the version of me that still needed their permission didn't live here anymore. She stayed behind in the courtroom, on that front porch, in the inbox where that text once arrived. You're no longer part of this family. I used to believe that sentence, but not anymore, because families are not defined by locks, or deeds, or who gets the last word. They are defined by who stays in the room when love becomes inconvenient. And that kind of family, I was still building it. The swing rocked gently, not forward, not back, just there. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I had to defend where I was sitting. I didn't feel like I had to earn my place in someone's story. I had my own now, and it started right here, on this swing, with the sound of wind moving through the lavender, and the quiet certainty that even though some things break, I didn't. There's a quiet that settles in when you finally stop asking for permission to exist. It's not loud, not triumphant. It's the kind of quiet that shows up in the morning light, when you make coffee just the way you like it, without explaining your choice. It's the quiet that arrives when you answer a question with no, full stop, without justification, without guilt. It's the quiet of coming home to yourself. For a long time, I thought my worth came from agreement. If people nodded along, I was doing something right. If they disagreed, if they pulled away, I must have said too much, been too much. I twisted myself into approval, bent my back into their boundaries, and every time I did, I moved further away from the woman I was trying to become. Veronica didn't teach me that. Life did. Family reinforced it. The world applauded it, but I was the one who believed it. I was the one who handed them the pen and said, "Here, you write about who I am. You tell me when it's okay to speak. You decide if I belong." And then I waited. For years. I waited for someone else to declare me worthy, to invite me back in, to forgive me for not being the kind of daughter, sister, or woman they understood. But here's the thing about waiting. It keeps you in the hallway of your own life. Not rejected, not welcomed. Just paused. And I'm done living on pause. After the hearing, after the swing, after the letter from Rachel and the listing of the house, I did something small, insignificant to anyone else. I bought a necklace. Just a simple gold bar. No gemstones, no initials. Just one word. engraved so faintly you had to be close to read it. Enough! Not worthy! Not chosen! Not healed! Just enough. As I am. As I've always been. One afternoon, I passed by a bookstore downtown and saw a flyer in the window. Writing workshop, telling the story they tried to silence. I went in, signed up on the spot. The first session was awkward. 10 women, most strangers, all holding stories like hot coals they'd never dared name aloud. We weren't there to vent. We were there to write, to reclaim, to unerase. The first prompt was simple. Write about the moment you knew you had to choose yourself. I stared at the blank page for a long time. And then, I wrote. It wasn't when she changed the locks. It wasn't when the lawyer emailed. It wasn't even when the judge said my name. It was when I looked in the mirror after everything and didn't flinch. That was the moment. Because I knew she didn't get to decide who I was. Not anymore. That's the thing about worth. It doesn't rise and fall with someone else's opinion. It doesn't disappear when you're excluded from a dinner table or a family photo. It doesn't evaporate when they roll their eyes, dismiss your pain, call you too much, too sensitive, or worse, overdramatic. Worth is what stays when everything else is stripped away. And for the first time, I could feel mine not as performance, but as presence. Sometimes I imagine what I'd say to Veronica now if she ever called. I don't think I'd yell. I don't think I'd lecture. I think I'd simply say, you don't get to define me. You don't get to decide when I matter, when I'm allowed to speak, when I'm allowed to belong. You can tell your story however you want, but you can't write mine. And you certainly don't get to sign it at the end. A few days ago, I got a message from one of the women in the writing group. She'd read something I'd written and said, that part about choosing yourself, I needed that. It made me cry. It made me breathe. And I realized my story was never just mine. It was someone else's map, too. Someone else's flashlight in the dark hallway of their own silence. And if I could be that for even one person, then nothing I went through was wasted. Not the heartbreak, not the court, not the porch, not the quiet. Especially not the quiet, because in that quiet, I found my voice. And in finding my voice, I remembered something no one ever had the power to take from me. My worth, my name, my place in this world. And now, I wear it around my neck. Just a small gold bar, light as truth, solid as self, unmistakably mine. People think stories end with the gavel, with the verdict, the signature. The moment the world says, you were right, you're vindicated, you won. But the truth, none of that was the beginning, and none of it was the end. The courtroom didn't birth me, the swing didn't define me. Even that house, the one I once clung to as proof of family, was never where I truly began. Because beginnings don't wait for fanfare. They happen quietly, in the dark, when no one's watching, when no one claps. The real beginning. It was the moment I looked at a closed door and decided not to beg it to open. It was when I held a legal document designed to erase me and chose not to vanish. It was when I stood in front of a judge and spoke not to win, but to be heard. Those were the moments. The ones no one framed. The ones no one saw. But I did. And that made them real. Beginnings aren't always marked by birth or ceremony. Sometimes they're marked by rupture. By the exact moment the rope snaps, when the things you thought would hold you don't, and you fall, and there's nothing beneath you but air and questions. But then, you realize your own arms are strong enough to catch yourself, and suddenly, the fall becomes flight. Not graceful at first, but undeniably yours. I used to measure life by recognition. By whom was I invited? Who mentioned my name? Who made room for me at the table? Now, I carry my own chair. I chose my own name. And when I enter a room, I no longer scan for approval. I ask only, is this a place I want to belong to? And if the answer is no, I leave. Not in anger, in sovereignty. The old version of me would have called that selfish. Now, I call it sacred, because protecting your peace isn't cruel. It's wisdom, especially when you've lived without it, especially when you've had to earn it not through perfection, but through the painful art of letting go. Letting go of people who knew your history but not your heart. Letting go of the stories they told about you in rooms you weren't allowed in. Letting go of proving, performing, pleading. Letting go of trying to be lovable on their terms. And instead, loving yourself on your own. I still think about the house sometimes, not with longing, but with perspective. It was never about the bricks, the porch, the swing. It was about memory, legacy, belonging. But now, I carry those things inside me, and they no longer need walls to exist. A few days ago, I drove past a bookstore I hadn't noticed before. The sign out front read, "Tell your story before someone else does." I parked, walked inside, ran my fingers along the spines of paperbacks and journals, poetry and fiction, and I smiled, because I already had, not for revenge, not for validation, but because stories, when told truthfully, become bridges between then and now, between hurt and healing, between who you were and who you're finally becoming. I bought a new journal that day, dark green cover, no lines inside. And on the first page, I wrote, "This isn't the end. This isn't even a conclusion. This is page 1. Then I turned the page and began, not from pain, from power. Because the beginning was never the ceremony. The beginning was every time I stood up after being told to sit down. Every time I chose honesty over harmony. Every time I stayed silent not because I was afraid, but because I was done performing. Every time I whispered, "I am enough," even when no one else said it back. That was the beginning, and it's still unfolding. Not on a stage, but in a cottage with a turquoise door, on a porch swing that creaks in the evening wind, with lavender blooming just outside the window, and a woman once forgotten, now fully remembered writing her story, one page at a time.